Upon delivering fresh produce to a luxury hotel, the humble farmer froze when she realized the millionaire guest was her husband, presumed dead for 9 years. She approached, and the rooster's crow cut through the pre-dawn silence like it had every morning for the past 9 years. But Marianne Caldwell was already awake. She'd been lying in bed since 4:30, staring at the ceiling fan that wobbled just enough to remind her she needed to fix it. Another item on the endless list of things that broke around the farm and never seemed to get proper attention. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet finding the cool hardwood floor. Through the window, the Texas sky was just beginning to blush pink at the edges, promising another scorcher. August in Ashton Springs didn't mess around. By noon, the heat would be thick enough to cut with a knife. Marianne pulled on her work clothes, faded jeans with honest dirt stains, a cotton t-shirt that had seen better days, and boots that molded to her feet like old friends. In the hallway, she paused outside Camille's door, listening to her 11-year-old daughter's steady breathing. Another hour before she'd need to wake her for school. The kitchen was her sanctuary in these quiet morning hours. She started the coffee, strong enough to wake the dead, as her mother used to say, and stepped onto the back porch. The farm stretched out before her in the growing light, neat rows of vegetables, the greenhouse she'd built with her own hands, and beyond that, the fields where she grew flowers you could actually eat, nasturtiums, pansies, violet petals that restaurants in Houston paid good money for. 9 years ago, this place had been Stephen's dream, more than hers. He'd talked about getting out of the city, raising their daughter somewhere she could run barefoot and climb trees without worry. "We'll grow everything we eat," he'd said, his hands gesturing wildly as he painted pictures with words. "Camille will know where her food comes from, not just think it magically appears in grocery stores." Marianne wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, feeling the familiar ache that came with these memories. Stephen Whitmore had been a dreamer, all right. Big plans, bigger promises. He'd also been the kind of man who could make you believe in those dreams, even when common sense whispered they were too good to be true. The explosion had happened on a Tuesday. She remembered that detail with crystal clarity. Tuesday, August 15th, 2:17 in the afternoon. She'd been hanging laundry on the line, Camille napping in her crib when the phone rang. Coast Guard. Boat explosion. No survivors. The funeral had been a blur of casseroles and sympathy cards. Half the town showed up to mourn Stephen Whitmore, the charming businessman who'd moved to Ashton Springs to start fresh. They'd lowered an empty casket into the ground. The official report had been clear about that. Complete carbonization. Nothing left to bury but memories and regret. "Mom," Camille's voice drifted from the kitchen, thick with sleep. "Out here, baby." Her daughter appeared in the doorway, dark hair sticking up at impossible angles, wearing an oversized t-shirt that reached her knees. She had Stephen's eyes, that particular shade of green that reminded Marianne of spring leaves. But everything else was pure Caldwell stubbornness. "You're up early," Camille said, settling onto the porch swing. "Couldn't sleep, thinking about the delivery to that new hotel today. The fancy one. That's the one. Golden Alcazar." Marianne tried to keep her voice neutral. She'd been dreading this delivery for weeks. Ever since the hotel's event coordinator had called about providing flowers and microgreens for their grand opening events. It was good money. Money they needed. But something about the whole setup made her skin crawl. Camille swung her legs, not quite reaching the porch floor. "Will you be back before I get home from school?" "Should be. It's just a quick run to Houston and back." Marianne studied her daughter's face. "You worried about something?" "Sarah Beth's mom said that hotel is where all the rich people go. The kind who never worked a day in their lives." Camille wrinkled her nose. "Sounds awful." Marianne almost smiled. Her daughter had inherited more than just the Caldwell stubbornness. She'd gotten their built-in radar for people who put on airs. Rich doesn't automatically mean bad, sweetheart. But you're right to be careful about people who've never had to work for anything. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher. Marianne had taught her daughter to appreciate these quiet moments, to find peace in simple things. It was a lesson learned the hard way, in those first terrible months after Stephen died, when every breath felt like drowning. The farm had saved them both, working the soil, coaxing life from seeds, watching things grow. It had given Marianne a reason to get up every morning when grief tried to pull her under, and Camille had flourished here, turning into a confident kid who could name every plant in their greenhouse and wasn't afraid of hard work. "I should get the truck loaded," Marianne said finally. "And you need to get ready for school. Do I have to wear the stupid dress for picture day? The stupid dress that makes you look beautiful and that we spent good money on?" "Yeah, you do," Camille groaned dramatically but headed inside. Marianne followed, already mentally organizing her day. Load the truck with the standing order. Baby lettuce, microgreens, edible flowers arranged in those fancy containers that made her vegetables look like art. Drive the hour to Houston. Make the delivery. Collect the check and get home before Camille's bus arrived. Simple, straightforward. Nothing that should make her hands shake as she loaded the truck. But as she arranged the last container of nasturtiums, Marianne couldn't shake the feeling that today was going to change everything. She'd learned to trust these instincts over the years. They'd kept her and Camille safe, helped her navigate the challenges of single motherhood and running a business in a world that often didn't take women farmers seriously. The feeling followed her as she drove toward Houston, past fields giving way to suburbs, then to the glass and steel maze of the city. The golden Alcazar Hotel rose from downtown like something out of a fairy tale. All marble columns and gleaming windows, the kind of place where people paid more for a single meal than Marianne spent on groceries in a month. She pulled around to the service entrance, checking her appearance in the rearview mirror. She looked exactly like what she was, a small-town farmer making a delivery. No pretense, no apology. If they wanted fancy vegetables, they'd have to deal with the farmer who grew them. Marianne had no way of knowing that in 30 minutes, her carefully constructed life would shatter like glass hitting concrete. She couldn't know that the man she'd mourned for 9 years was about to walk through a hotel lobby and turn her world upside down. All she knew was that her hands were shaking as she grabbed the first crate, and for the life of her, she couldn't figure out why. The Golden Alcazar Hotel's service entrance buzzed with activity. Caterers wheeling in trays, florists arranging massive displays, and staff members scurrying around with clipboards and worried expressions. Marianne maneuvered her truck through the controlled chaos, following hand signals from a young man in a crisp uniform who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Farmer's market delivery?" he asked, consulting his tablet. "Marianne Caldwell, Caldwell Farms," she replied, climbing out of the truck. "Microgreens and edible flowers for the restaurant. Bay 3. Chef Rodriguez is expecting you." The service corridor was a stark contrast to what she imagined the guest areas looked like. Concrete floors, fluorescent lighting, and the kind of utilitarian design that prioritized function over form. Marianne appreciated it. This was the real world, where actual work got done. Chef Rodriguez turned out to be a woman about Marianne's age, with laugh lines around her eyes and flour permanently embedded under her fingernails. "You must be our farmer," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I've been dying to see what you brought us." For the next 20 minutes, they went through each container methodically. Chef Rodriguez examined the microgreens like they were precious stones. Nodding approval at the vibrant colors and clean cuts, she popped a nasturtium flower in her mouth and closed her eyes. "Perfect peppery bite," she murmured. "These are going on the lamb special tonight." Marianne felt the familiar surge of pride that came when someone truly appreciated her work. Too many people saw farming as simple. Stick seeds in dirt, wait for things to grow. They had no idea about soil composition, pest management, harvest timing, or the 1,000 small decisions that meant the difference between mediocre produce and something extraordinary. "I'll need your signature here," Chef Rodriguez said, handing over the invoice. "And honestly, if today goes well, I'd love to set up a regular order. This hotel caters to people who know good food when they taste it." They were finalizing the details when a server burst through the kitchen doors. "Chef, they need you in the main dining room. Something about the centerpieces not matching the linens." Chef Rodriguez rolled her eyes. "Rich people problems," she muttered to Marianne. "Want to see what we're dealing with? The lobby's worth a look if you've never been in a place like this." Curiosity won out over common sense. Marianne followed the chef through a service door that opened into the hotel's main level, and immediately understood why people paid ridiculous amounts to stay here. The lobby soared 3 stories high, all cream-colored marble and gold accents that caught the light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks, casting rainbow patterns on the polished floors. Everything gleamed with the kind of perfection that money could buy, and armies of staff could maintain. "Impressive, right?" Chef Rodriguez said. "Sometimes I forget people live like this." Marianne was about to respond when movement near the concierge desk caught her eye. A man in an expensive suit was speaking to someone behind the counter, his profile partially visible. Something about the way he held his shoulders, the gesture he made with his left hand, triggered a memory so sharp it nearly buckled her knees. She knew that gesture. She'd seen it 1,000 times during late-night conversations in their tiny apartment, when Stephen would talk about his dreams for their future. He always led with his left hand when he was making a point, a quirk she'd found endearing. The man turned slightly, and Marianne's world tilted sideways. It was Stephen's face, older, more refined, with silver threading through hair that had once been solid brown. But it was undeniably him. The scar through his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the way his mouth quirked up slightly on one side, the exact shade of green eyes that she saw every morning in their daughter's face. Marianne's vision grayed at the edges. She gripped the nearest pillar for support, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone in the lobby could hear it. Stephen Whitmore, her husband, the father of her child, the man she'd buried 9 years ago. He was alive. He was here. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than she made in 3 months and speaking to the concierge like he owned the place. Ma'am, are you okay?" Chef Rodriguez was at her elbow, concern creasing her features. Marianne couldn't speak. She watched as Stephen, because it was Stephen, despite the impossible circumstances, glanced in her direction. Their eyes met across the marble expanse, and she saw recognition flicker across his features. Shock, fear, something that might have been longing. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at each other across 9 years of grief and lies. Then Stephen's expression shuddered. He said something quick to the concierge, turned on his heel, and disappeared down a corridor marked, "Private, authorized personnel only." "I need to," Marianne started, then stopped. Need to what? Chase after a ghost? Demand answers from a man who was supposed to be dead? "You look like you've seen a ghost," Chef Rodriguez said gently. "Why don't you sit down for a minute?" That's exactly what she'd seen. A ghost walking around in Italian leather shoes. "I'm fine," Marianne managed, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. I thought I recognized someone." She forced herself to walk back toward the service area on unsteady legs, making appropriate responses to Chef Rodriguez's continued chatter about future orders and delivery schedules, but her mind was spinning like a tornado, trying to process what she'd just seen. Stephen was alive. Not just alive. He was clearly living some kind of elaborate double life that involved expensive hotels and private corridors, while she'd spent 9 years scraping by on a farm, raising their daughter alone, mourning a man who was apparently very much alive and well. She made it to her truck before the fury hit. 9 years. 9 years of struggling to make ends meet, of watching Camille grow up without a father, of nights spent crying into her pillow and days spent putting on a brave face for everyone who offered sympathy and casseroles. 9 years of rebuilding herself from the ground up, of learning to be both mother and father, of carrying the weight of their small family entirely on her shoulders. And he was alive, living in luxury while she scraped together money for school clothes and worried about whether the truck would make it through another winter. Marianne slammed her hand against the steering wheel, welcoming the sharp pain that shot up her arm. It helped cut through the unreality of the situation, anchored her in something physical and immediate. She was fishing for her keys when she noticed it, a small white card tucked under her windshield wiper. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she recognized despite the years. With shaking fingers, she unfolded it. "Greenhouse on the terrace. Please forgive me." No signature. None needed. Marianne stared at the card until the words blurred. Part of her wanted to drive straight home, pretend this had never happened, go back to the life she'd built from the ashes of her grief. It was a good life, if not an easy one. She and Camille were happy, or as happy as they could be with the Stephen-shaped hole in their family. But another part of her, the part that had spent 9 years wondering if she could have done something different, if she could have somehow prevented the tragedy that tore her family apart, needed answers. The greenhouse on the terrace. She could find it, if she wanted to. The question was, did she want to open this door? Because once she did, there would be no going back to the simple certainty of widowhood and the clean grief of mourning someone who was actually dead. Marianne looked at the card one more time, then slipped it into her pocket next to her truck keys. Some doors, once they appeared, demanded to be opened. The hotel's terrace greenhouse was a marvel of glass and steel perched on the 20th floor, filled with exotic plants that probably cost more than Marianne's annual income. She found it after 20 minutes of wandering through service corridors and taking 3 different elevators, following cryptic directions from staff members who seemed surprised that anyone was looking for it. Stephen was waiting among the orchids. He stood with his back to the entrance, shoulders rigid with tension, staring out at the Houston skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms that were more muscular than she remembered. 9 years of physical labor, maybe, or expensive gym memberships. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said without turning around. His voice was the same, deeper than average, with that slight rasp from the cigarettes he'd never quite managed to quit. Hearing it again after 9 years felt like being sucker-punched. "I wasn't sure either," Marianne replied. She stayed near the door, every instinct screaming at her to run. "You look good for a dead man." Stephen turned then, and she saw the full extent of how the years had changed him. The boy she'd married at 22 had become a man with silver at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. But it was definitely him. The scar through his eyebrow, the way he favored his left side, the mouth she'd kissed goodbye on that last Tuesday morning. "Marianne," her name came out like a prayer or a curse. "God, you look like a farmer who's been busting her ass for 9 years while thinking her husband was dead." She crossed her arms over her chest. "Yeah, that's exactly what I look like." He flinched. "I deserved that. You deserved a lot worse than that." The fury was building again, hot and clean. "Do you have any idea what you put us through? What you put Camille through? Every single day," his voice cracked. "Every goddamn day for 9 years. Then why?" The word exploded out of her. "Why let us think you were dead? Why put us through hell while you were, living it up in hotels like this?" Stephen ran a hand through his hair, another gesture she remembered too well. "It's complicated. Uncomplicate it." He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because they would have killed you both." The simple certainty in his tone stopped her cold, whatever she'd been expecting. An affair, a midlife crisis, some selfish abandonment of responsibility. It wasn't this. Who would have killed us? Lawrence Price, Senator Calloway, their whole network. Stephen moved to a nearby bench and sat down heavily. "I found out they were using my business to launder money. Millions of dollars. Marianne, drug money, arms deals, political bribes. They'd been using me for years without my knowledge. So you went to the police." "I tried." His laugh was bitter. "Turned out half the cops in their pocket were on their payroll too. The one honest detective I found. He turned up dead in a car accident 3 days after I talked to him." Marianne felt ice forming in her stomach. "Stephen, they knew I knew, and they made it very clear what would happen if I tried to expose them." He pulled out his phone, scrolled to a photo, and held it out to her. The image was grainy but unmistakable. 2-year-old Camille playing in their backyard, taken with a telephoto lens from somewhere beyond their property line, written across the bottom in red ink. Accidents happened to little girls too. Marianne's knees went weak. She sank onto the bench beside him, staring at the photo. "They threatened our baby. That was just the first one. They had pictures of her at daycare, at the grocery store with you, sleeping in her crib." Stephen's hands were shaking as he put the phone away. "They described your daily routine down to the minute. What time you left for work, which route you took, where you bought coffee. So you faked your death." The pieces were starting to fit together, creating a picture that was somehow more horrifying than his simple abandonment. Lawrence arranged it, paid off the coroner, switched dental records, made sure there was nothing left to identify after the explosion. Stephen touched his side, and Marianne noticed he was favoring it more than usual. "I barely made it out alive myself. Spent 3 months in a private hospital while they created Alexander Moore. Alexander Moore. My new identity, new face, new background, new life." He gestured to his expensive clothes. "All of it designed to keep you and Camille safe. By marrying someone else. The words tasted like poison. Stephen's face crumpled. Renata Calloway, the senator's daughter. It was part of the deal. Marry into the family, become a legitimate part of their operation. Keep my mouth shut, and they'd leave you alone. Did you love her? Marianne hated herself for asking, but she had to know. I loved you. Only you. Every day for 9 years. Stephen turned to face her fully. Renata knows it's not a real marriage. She's as trapped in this as I am. She grew up knowing what her father really is, but she's too scared to leave. Marianne stared at her hands. 9 years of grief, of struggling to make ends meet, of raising their daughter alone, all while Stephen lived a lie to keep them safe. It was too much to process, too big to fit inside her understanding of how the world worked. Show me, she said finally. What? The scars. You said you barely made it out alive. Show me. Without hesitation, Stephen unbuttoned his shirt. His torso was a roadmap of surgical scars. Long lines where doctors had pieced him back together. Circular marks from burns. Areas where skin grafts had never quite matched the original. The worst was a jagged line that ran from his sternum to his hip. The kind of scar that spoke of emergency surgery and touch-and-go recoveries. Marianne reached out instinctively, her fingers tracing the raised tissue. His skin was warm, real, alive. This wasn't a ghost or a hallucination. This was her husband, scarred and changed, but breathing. They almost succeeded, Stephen said quietly. The explosion was supposed to kill me for real. Lawrence miscalculated. Either that, or part of him wanted me to survive. Hard to tell with him. And you've been living this lie ever since. Until today. He caught her hand, pressed it flat against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat. Until I saw you in that lobby and realized I couldn't do it anymore. I can't watch you from a distance and pretend I don't exist. I can't let Camille grow up thinking her father abandoned her. So what are you proposing? Help me bring them down. The words came out in a rush. I know where the bodies are buried, Marianne. Literally and figuratively. I have access to files, bank records, recorded conversations. I can destroy them, but I can't do it alone. And if we fail, then at least we fail together. Marianne looked at him, really looked at him. This wasn't the dreamy idealist she'd married. This was a man who'd been forged in fire, who'd sacrificed everything to protect his family, and was now willing to risk everything to reclaim it. There's one condition, she said finally. Anything. If we do this, if we take down these bastards, we do it right. No half measures, no deals, no compromises. We expose everything and everyone, and we make sure they can never hurt another family the way they hurt ours. Stephen's smile was the first genuine expression she'd seen from him. I was hoping you'd say that, for the first time in 9 years. Marianne felt like she was looking at her husband again. The plan started simple enough. Marianne would continue her regular deliveries to the Golden Alcazar, and Stephen would find ways to slip information into her vegetable crates, USB drives hidden in hollowed-out carrots, documents rolled inside asparagus bundles, photographs tucked between layers of lettuce leaves. Like some kind of agricultural spy novel, Marianne muttered, examining the tiny flash drive Stephen had concealed in a fake radish. They were back in the greenhouse. 3 days after their first meeting, she'd told Camille she was meeting with a new restaurant client. Technically true, if you counted conspiracy as cuisine. I know it sounds crazy, Stephen said, but they monitor my every move, phone calls, emails, even my browsing history. The only time I'm alone is during these hotel inspections. And even then, I can't be obvious about it. The flash drive contained financial records from Lawrence Price's shipping company, invoices that didn't match manifests, payments to companies that existed only on paper, routes that took cargo ships on inexplicable detours through international waters. This is enough to start an investigation, Marianne said, scrolling through the files on her laptop. But we need someone we can trust. That someone turned out to be Marcus Chen, a federal prosecutor who'd grown up 3 towns over from Ashton Springs. Marianne had gone to high school with his sister, and the family still had a reputation for being honest to a fault. The kind of people who returned wallets with all the money still inside. I need to be careful about how I approach this, Marianne told Stephen during their next meeting. One wrong word and we're both dead. She'd arranged to meet Chen at a coffee shop in Austin, far enough from Houston to avoid Calloway's network, but close enough to seem like a casual encounter. The story she'd prepared was simple. She'd overheard some troubling conversations while making deliveries to high-end hotels and restaurants. A concerned citizen doing her civic duty, Chen turned out to be a thin man with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense focus that came from years of prosecuting white-collar crime. He listened to her carefully edited version of events without interruption, occasionally making notes in a leather portfolio. "These are serious allegations, Mrs. Caldwell," he said finally. "Do you have any evidence to support them?" Marianne slid the first flash drive across the table. "This is just the beginning." Chen's eyes widened as he reviewed the financial records on his laptop. "Where did you get this? Does it matter if it's legitimate? It matters for prosecution, but not for investigation." He was already making notes. "I'll need more, though. A lot more. Financial crimes like this require overwhelming evidence to overcome the kind of legal firepower these people can afford." That became Marianne's new routine. Twice weekly deliveries to the Golden Alcazar, each one carrying hidden intelligence in her organic vegetables. Stephen grew bolder as the weeks passed, providing not just financial records but recorded conversations, photographs of meetings, even copies of emails between Lawrence and various politicians. The most damning evidence came from Senator Calloway's own files. Stephen had managed to access the man's home office during a family dinner, copying documents while Renata distracted her father with questions about campaign strategy. "He keeps everything," Stephen explained during one of their greenhouse meetings. "Bank transfers, shell company formations, even recordings of phone calls where he talks about eliminating problems. The man's either incredibly arrogant or incredibly stupid. Maybe both," Marianne said, examining photos of handwritten notes that detailed which judges could be bought and which law enforcement officials were already on the payroll. "God, Stephen. This goes all the way to Washington." "I know. It's bigger than we thought." It was also more dangerous than they'd anticipated. Marianne started noticing things. Cars that seemed to follow her route between Ashton Springs and Houston. Unfamiliar faces in familiar places. Phone calls that ended abruptly when she answered. Nothing overt enough to be sure, but enough to make her sleep with a baseball bat next to her bed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus Chen called her on a Tuesday evening, excitement crackling in his voice. "I've been running down some of the shell companies in your files," he said. "Found a reporter who's been working this angle for months. Jessica Walsh from the Houston Chronicle. She's got sources inside the Attorney General's office and contacts with federal agents who aren't on Calloway's payroll. Can we trust her? She's clean. More importantly, she's got the resources to help us build an airtight case. Are you willing to meet with her?" Jessica Walsh turned out to be a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and the kind of intense energy that came from years of investigative reporting. She met Marianne at a diner in Beaumont, bringing with her a thick folder of her own research. "I've been tracking Senator Calloway for 3 years, she said without preamble. "Money laundering, bribery, possible connections to organized crime. But every time I get close, witnesses disappear or evidence gets mysteriously compromised. What makes you think this time will be different?" "Because this time I have someone on the inside." Walsh leaned forward. "Your source, whoever they are, has access to information I could never get through normal channels. Financial records, private communications, operational details. This isn't just hearsay or speculation. This is documentary evidence." They spent 2 hours going through the materials Stephen had provided, with Walsh asking pointed questions about sources and chain of custody. Marianne stuck to her story about overhearing conversations and finding documents that had been carelessly discarded, but she could tell the reporter wasn't entirely convinced. "I don't care if you're protecting someone," Walsh said finally. "What matters is that this information is legitimate." And it is. I've already verified half these bank transfers through independent sources. So what's the next step? We build an airtight case, document everything, establish clear chains of evidence, identify witnesses who can't be intimidated or bought off. Then we coordinate with federal prosecutors to take down the entire network at once. How long will that take? Months if we're careful, maybe longer. Walsh closed her folder. The question is, can your source keep providing intelligence without getting caught? Because once we make our move, There won't be any going back. That night, Marianne drove home through the Texas darkness, thinking about what Walsh had said. They were committed now, not just to exposing the corruption, but to a timeline that stretched months into the future. Months of deception, of living double lives, of pretending that Stephen was still dead while they slowly assembled the evidence to destroy his captors. It was also months of stolen moments in greenhouse meetings, of rebuilding trust, one conversation at a time, of remembering why they'd fallen in love in the first place. Despite everything, the lies, the danger, the years of separation, she was falling for him all over again. But there was still Camille to consider. Their daughter deserved to know the truth about her father, but not until they could guarantee her safety. That meant maintaining the fiction a little longer, living with the guilt of keeping such a massive secret from the person who mattered most. As she pulled into her driveway, Marianne noticed a light on in Camille's bedroom window. Her daughter was probably reading under the covers, lost in whatever young adult novel had captured her imagination this week. Normal teenage behavior in a life that was anything but normal. Soon, Marianne promised silently. Soon they'd be a real family again. She just hoped they'd all survive long enough to see it happen. The invitation arrived on cream-colored paper with the golden Alcazar's embossed letterhead, hand-delivered by a courier who waited while Marianne signed for it. Formal language announced the launch of the Roots and Harvest program, a new initiative to showcase local farmers and sustainable agriculture. Caldwell Farms was cordially invited to participate in the inaugural gala. Marianne stared at the elegant script, her blood running cold. This wasn't a coincidence. "Mom, what's wrong?" Camille looked up from her homework at the kitchen table. "You look like someone just walked over your grave." "Nothing. Sweetheart, just business stuff." Marianne forced a smile and tucked the invitation into her purse. "How's that algebra coming along?" But her mind was racing. In 6 weeks of secret meetings and intelligence gathering, Stephen had never mentioned any agricultural program. Someone else was pulling strings, and Marianne had a sinking feeling about who that someone might be. She called Stephen that evening, using the burner phone he'd given her for emergencies. "Renata launched what?" His voice was sharp with surprise. "The Roots and Harvest program. She wants to showcase local farmers at some kind of gala, Stephen. She specifically invited me." Silence stretched across the connection. When Stephen finally spoke, his voice was tight with worry. "She knows somehow. She knows about us. How is that possible? Renata's smarter than her father gives her credit for. She's been asking questions about my schedule, making casual comments about the hotel's new suppliers. I thought she was just making conversation. But she was building a case." Marianne felt sick. "What does this mean?" "I don't know yet. Let me see what I can find out." The answer came 3 days later during their regular greenhouse meeting. Stephen looked haggard, like he hadn't slept in a week. "She confronted me last night," he said without preamble. Not directly, but close enough. Started talking about how marriage should be built on trust and honesty, how secrets always come to light eventually. "Does she know everything?" "I don't think so. But she suspects I'm not the devoted husband I pretend to be." Stephen ran his hands through his hair. "She's been watching me, Marianne, taking note of when I'm distracted, when I disappear during hotel inspections. She's smart enough to put pieces together. So what's her endgame with this program? Control. She wants to flush out whatever I'm hiding and use it as leverage." Stephen's expression was grim. Renata grew up in her father's world. She learned early that information is power, and power is survival. But Renata Calloway's motivations were more complex than either of them realized. That same afternoon, while Stephen and Marianne were plotting in the greenhouse, Renata was in her father's study, going through financial records with the methodical precision of someone who'd been trained to spot discrepancies. The senator's home office was a monument to political power, signed photographs with presidents and foreign dignitaries, awards from various lobbying groups, and enough leather-bound books to stock a small library. Most of the books had never been opened. They were props in the carefully constructed image of a scholarly statesman. Renata ignored the theatrical elements and focused on the filing cabinets her father thought were secure. She'd learned the combination years ago by watching him open them during late-night phone calls, back when she was young enough to be invisible to adults conducting important business. What she found made her stomach turn. The financial records painted a clear picture of systematic corruption stretching back over a decade. Shell companies, laundered money, bribes disguised as consulting fees, and payments to individuals she recognized as judges and law enforcement officials. Her father wasn't just a corrupt politician. He was the linchpin in a criminal organization that touched every level of government. But it was the personal files that really shattered her world. Medical records showing that her father had been slowly poisoning her mother for years, gradually increasing doses of medication that would eventually cause the heart failure that killed her. Insurance policies taken out on political rivals who later died in convenient accidents. And photos. Surveillance photos of families who had crossed the senator, including children. One file made her hand shake so violently she almost dropped it. Pictures of a small girl playing in a farmyard, marked with the name Camille Caldwell, and dated from years earlier. Notes in her father's handwriting detailed the child's daily routine, her school schedule, her vulnerabilities. Renata had always known her father was ruthless, but this was beyond political hardball. This was the systematic stalking and intimidation of innocents, including children, the kind of evil that destroyed families for the sake of political power. She thought about Alexander, Stephen, and his obvious discomfort during family dinners. The way he flinched when her father talked about eliminating problems. The distant look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching, like he was mourning something lost. Suddenly, his behavior made perfect sense. The Roots and Harvest program hadn't been conceived as a trap for Stephen's secret activities. It had started as exactly what the invitation claimed, a way to showcase local agriculture and position the senator as an environmental advocate during his upcoming re-election campaign. But as Renata researched local farms for the program, one name kept appearing in contexts that had nothing to do with agriculture. Marianne Caldwell's farm was listed in her father's surveillance files. The woman herself appeared in background checks related to Stephen's previous identity. Most tellingly, there were financial records showing payments to private investigators who had been monitoring both the farm and its owner for years. Renata realized she was looking at the family her father had threatened to control her husband. The moral calculus was suddenly clear. She could continue living the lie, pretending ignorance while her father used Stephen as a pawn in his criminal enterprise. She could maintain her comfortable position as the senator's daughter, with all the wealth and social status that came with it, or she could burn it all down. The decision came easier than she'd expected. Maybe it was years of watching her father destroy people without conscience, or the memory of her mother's slow, agonizing death, or simply the recognition that Stephen had been protecting innocence the only way he could. Whatever the reason, Renata Calloway made her choice. She began modifying the Roots and Harvest program, but not as a trap for Stephen. Instead, she was creating an opportunity, a public forum where evidence could be presented, witnesses could speak, and the truth could emerge in a setting too visible for her father to control. The gala would still happen, but it would serve a very different purpose than anyone expected. 3 weeks later, as Marianne stood in her kitchen rereading the invitation for the dozenth time, she had no idea that across town, the senator's daughter was preparing to commit the ultimate act of betrayal against her own family. She also didn't know that Stephen had come to a similar conclusion during his own sleepless nights, and that he was preparing to risk everything in one desperate gambit to reclaim his life. The pieces were moving on a board that none of them fully understood, but the endgame was approaching faster than anyone realized. The only question was whether they would be playing as allies or adversaries when the final moves were made. The Golden Alcazar buzzed with controlled chaos in the hours before the Roots and Harvest gala. Marianne arrived early, ostensibly to oversee the setup of her farm's display, but really to scout the venue and finalize last-minute details with Stephen. The main ballroom had been transformed into an agricultural wonderland. Elegant displays of locally grown produce arranged like art installations, rustic wooden signs identifying each farm, and servers in crisp white uniforms preparing to offer samples of Texas-grown delicacies. Marianne wore a simple black dress she'd owned for years, the kind of timeless piece that could work for funerals or fancy dinners with equal appropriateness. She'd debated buying something new, but decided that authenticity mattered more than fashion. She was here as a farmer, not a socialite, and her clothes should reflect that truth. Mrs. Caldwell, Renata Calloway, appeared at her elbow, resplendent in emerald silk that probably cost more than Marianne's truck. "I'm so glad you could make it. Your display looks absolutely beautiful. Up close, The senator's daughter was younger than Marianne had expected, mid-30s, with the kind of polished elegance that came from a lifetime of privilege. But there was something in her eyes, a sharpness that suggested intelligence and perhaps desperation. "Thank you for including us," Marianne replied carefully. "It's quite an honor. The honor is all ours. Local agriculture is so important, don't you think? The backbone of our communities." Renata's smile was perfect, but her hands were shaking slightly. "I do hope you'll stay for my father's speech. He has some very interesting things to say about supporting local farmers." Senator Richard Callaway held court near the main entrance, surrounded by admirers and sycophants who laughed too loudly at his jokes and nodded too eagerly at his pronouncements. He was exactly what central casting would order for a corrupt politician. Silver-haired, commanding presence, expensive suit, and the kind of practiced charm that could convince people to vote against their own interests. Lawrence Price lurked nearby, somehow managing to look both invisible and menacing at the same time. Marianne had studied his photograph extensively over the past weeks, but seeing him in person sent chills down her spine. This was the man who'd orchestrated Stephen's death, who'd threatened her daughter, who'd built an empire on corruption and violence. Stephen, Alexander, she had to remember to think of him as Alexander here, stood slightly apart from the main group, reviewing notes for what she knew would be a carefully scripted speech about international investment opportunities. He looked the part of a successful businessman, but Marianne could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he favored his left side where the worst scars were hidden beneath his tailored shirt. The guests began arriving at 7 o'clock, a carefully curated mix of politicians, business leaders, and social influencers who could amplify the senator's message about environmental responsibility and economic development. Golden masks had been distributed at the entrance, a theatrical touch that was supposed to evoke harvest celebrations, but instead felt ominous to Marianne. She mingled with the crowd, making small talk about sustainable farming practices, while mentally cataloging faces and conversations. Jessica Walsh, the reporter, was there with a photographer, officially covering the event for the Chronicle's lifestyle section, but actually documenting everyone in attendance. Marcus Chen had positioned federal agents throughout the venue as security consultants, their presence unremarkable, but their positioning strategic. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please." Senator Callaway's voice cut through the cocktail chatter, drawing the crowd toward the small stage that had been erected at the far end of the ballroom. The senator stood behind a podium adorned with locally grown flowers, the perfect image of a politician who cared about both constituents and environment. "Tonight, we celebrate the hardworking men and women who feed our great state," he began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who'd given thousands of speeches. "Texas agriculture is the foundation of our economy, the heart of our communities, and the future of sustainable growth." Marianne watched the crowd's reaction, noting which applause lines landed and which fell flat. These were sophisticated people who understood political theater, but they were buying what Callaway was selling. He talked about farm subsidies and environmental protection, about supporting small businesses and preserving rural traditions. If you didn't know better, you'd think he was a genuine advocate for agricultural interests. "And now," the senator continued, "I'd like to introduce someone who embodies the future of Texas business. A man who understands that true prosperity comes from investing in our people and our land. Please welcome Alexander Moore of the Meridian Investment Group." Stephen took the stage with confident strides, every inch the successful businessman. His speech was a masterclass in saying nothing while sounding important. Vague promises about economic development, platitudes about public-private partnerships, carefully worded commitments that could mean anything or nothing depending on the listener's interpretation. But Marianne wasn't listening to the words. She was watching his hands, looking for the signal they'd agreed upon. 3 fingers tapped against the podium would mean the plan was still on track. A pause to adjust his tie would mean abort. The 3 taps came during his conclusion, almost imperceptible but clear to someone who knew to look for them. "Thank you," Stephen said, acknowledging the polite applause. "And now, I believe Mrs. Callaway has a special announcement." Renata took the stage with the grace of someone accustomed to public speaking, but Marianne caught the slight tremor in her voice as she began. "Thank you, Alexander. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight is about more than celebrating agriculture. It's about celebrating truth and transparency in all our endeavors." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "Which is why I'm pleased to announce that the Golden Alcazar will be opening its financial records for public audit. To ensure that our commitment to local farmers is backed by genuine investment rather than empty promises." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some confused murmurs, a few nervous laughs, and several sharp looks between the senator and Lawrence Price. This clearly wasn't part of the planned program. "Additionally," Renata continued, her voice growing stronger, "we'll be providing full transparency about our funding sources and political contributions, because the people of Texas deserve to know exactly who is supporting their elected officials and how that money is being used." Senator Callaway's smile never wavered, but Marianne saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. Lawrence Price had gone pale, his eyes darting toward the exits as if calculating escape routes. "My daughter is quite the idealist," the senator said, smoothly taking control of the microphone. "Of course, such transparency requires careful legal review to protect both our investors and our political partners, but the sentiment is admirable." He was trying to walk back Renata's statement, to frame it as youthful enthusiasm rather than serious policy. But the damage was done. Several reporters were already taking notes, and cell phones had appeared throughout the crowd as people began documenting what felt like an unscripted moment of political drama. "Speaking of transparency," Renata said, reclaiming the microphone with a smile that looked genuinely dangerous, "I have something special to share with our guests tonight. If you'd all please follow me to the private dining room, I believe you'll find the evening's final presentation quite illuminating." She stepped down from the stage and began walking toward a corridor marked Private Events. The crowd followed. Drawn by curiosity and the promise of insider access that wealthy people couldn't resist, Marianne caught Stephen's eye across the room. He gave her the slightest nod toward the corridor Renata had indicated. Whatever was about to happen, it was time for the endgame to begin. The private dining room buzzed with anticipation as Houston's elite filed in, their golden masks catching the light from crystal chandeliers. Marianne stayed near the back, her heart hammering as she watched Renata position herself beside an ornate wall safe that had been concealed behind a painting of Texas bluebonnets. "Ladies and gentlemen," Renata announced, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "tonight you've heard wonderful speeches about transparency and supporting local agriculture. I'd like to show you exactly what that support looks like in practice." Senator Callaway was pushing through the crowd, his political smile strained. "Darling, perhaps we should—" "Safe number 27, Renata continued, ignoring her father's attempt at interruption. She produced a small golden key from her evening bag. "Contains the real records of how agricultural subsidies have been distributed, which farms received genuine support, and which payments went to somewhat more creative enterprises." Lawrence Price had reached the front of the crowd, his face flushed with barely controlled panic. "Mrs. Callaway, I think there's been some confusion." "No confusion at all." Renata's smile was radiant and terrifying. "Just truth." The safe opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent room. Inside were manila folders, USB drives, and what appeared to be audio recording equipment. Renata began removing documents with deliberate care, as if she were unveiling precious artifacts. "For instance," she said, holding up a thick folder, "here are the real financial records for the Meridian Investment Group's agricultural initiatives. Fascinating reading, really, especially the parts about money laundering and political bribery." The room erupted. Guests began talking over each other, some demanding explanations, others heading for the exits. Cell phones appeared as people started recording and calling their own damage control teams. Senator Callaway lunged toward his daughter, but Stephen, Alexander, intercepted him smoothly. "I wouldn't," Stephen said quietly, his voice carrying enough menace to stop the older man in his tracks. "Not in front of all these witnesses." "You bastard," the senator hissed. "This was your plan all along." "Actually, no." Stephen's smile was cold. "Your daughter managed this particular revelation all on her own, though I have to admit, the timing is perfect." Marcus Chen appeared at the room's entrance, flanked by federal agents who were no longer pretending to be security consultants. "Senator Callaway, Lawrence Price, you're under arrest for money laundering, political corruption, and conspiracy to commit fraud." The agents moved with practiced efficiency, producing badges and handcuffs while reading Miranda rights. Lawrence Price tried to push past them toward a service exit, but found his path blocked by more agents who had clearly been positioned throughout the hotel. "This is political persecution," Senator Calloway shouted as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "I demand to speak to my attorney." "You'll have plenty of time for that," Chen replied calmly. Along with explaining these financial records and audio recordings, Renata had continued removing evidence from the safe, creating neat piles on a nearby table: bank statements, wire transfer records, recorded phone conversations, photographs of meetings that were never supposed to be documented. Years of meticulous record-keeping by a man who'd never imagined his own daughter would use his obsessive documentation against him. "How long have you been planning this?" Marianne found herself standing beside Renata as the arrests continued around them. "Months," Renata replied without looking up from the documents. "Ever since I realized what my father really was, what my marriage really was." She glanced toward Stephen, who was speaking quietly with one of the federal agents. "Alexander, Stephen, whatever his real name is, he's been protecting his family the only way he could. I respect that. And you? What happens to you now?" Renata's laugh was brittle. "I suppose I'll find out what life looks like when you're not living a lie." She handed Marianne a sealed envelope. "These are the surveillance photos of your daughter, along with the names of everyone my father hired to watch your family. You'll want to give these to the prosecutors." Marianne's hand shook as she took the envelope. 9 years of looking over her shoulder, of wondering if they were truly safe, and now she would finally have names and faces to go with her fears. The chaos was beginning to organize itself into something resembling an orderly crime scene. Jessica Walsh and her photographer were documenting everything, their cameras capturing the fall of one of Texas's most powerful political dynasties. Other reporters had arrived. Word traveled fast in Houston's interconnected world of politics and media. Stephen appeared at Marianne's elbow. "We need to get you out of here," he said quietly. "Once the media realizes who you are, this place will become a circus." But Marianne wasn't ready to leave, not yet. "Excuse me," she said, raising her voice above the controlled chaos. "Could I have everyone's attention for just a moment?" The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning toward the farmer in the simple black dress who'd somehow ended up at the center of a political earthquake. "My name is Marianne Caldwell," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. 9 years ago, my husband Stephen Whitmore was supposedly killed in a boat explosion. Tonight, I learned that his death was faked to protect our family from the people you just saw arrested." Cameras swung toward her, reporters scrambling to get closer. This was the human interest angle that would dominate headlines for weeks. "Stephen," she called out, and he stepped forward reluctantly. "These people need to know the truth, all of it." For a moment, he looked like he might refuse. Then his shoulders straightened, and he moved to stand beside her. "My name is Stephen Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "For 9 years, I've lived as Alexander Moore to protect my wife and daughter from the criminal organization that Senator Calloway and Lawrence Price were running. Tonight, that protection is no longer necessary. Because the truth is finally public." The room exploded again, but this time it was different. Instead of panic and damage control, there was a sense of resolution, of justice finally being served. The reporters were getting the story of a lifetime. The federal agents had their arrests, and the witnesses had seen corruption exposed in real time. "Mr. Whitmore," Jessica Walsh called out, her recorder held high. "What happens now?" Stephen looked at Marianne, then at the crowd of powerful people who had just witnessed the destruction of everything they thought they knew about Texas politics. "Now we go home," he said simply, "and we try to rebuild what was stolen from us." But even as he spoke, Marianne saw Lawrence Price being led away in handcuffs, his eyes fixed on her with unmistakable hatred. Senator Calloway might be finished, but his lieutenant was already planning his next move. The war was won, but the peace would be harder to achieve than any of them realized. Outside the golden Alcazar, Houston's skyline glittered with lights that promised prosperity and progress. But in the private dining room of a luxury hotel, a family was finally free to stop running from the shadows. The question was whether the shadows would let them go. The aftermath of the arrests unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance, but one where half the dancers had forgotten their steps. Federal agents processed evidence while reporters shouted questions over each other. their cameras capturing every moment of what would become known as the Golden Mask scandal. Stephen stood at the edge of the chaos, watching Lawrence Price being led away in handcuffs. Even restrained and defeated, the man managed to project menace, his eyes promising retribution to anyone who'd played a role in his downfall. When his gaze found Stephen, the message was clear. This wasn't over. "Stephen," Marianne appeared at his side, her voice barely audible above the commotion. "Are you okay?" "Ask me in a week," he replied, but managed a smile for her. Maybe a month. The truth was, he felt untethered. For 9 years, every decision had been filtered through the need to maintain his cover, to protect his family by living a lie. Now that the lie was exposed, he wasn't sure who he was supposed to be. "Mr. Whitmore," a reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "How does it feel to be alive again?" The question hit harder than intended. How did it feel? Like being resurrected, like emerging from a long nightmare, like discovering he could breathe again after nearly a decade of holding his breath. "It feels like coming home," he said finally. Marcus Chen appeared through the crowd, his expression grim despite the successful arrests. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Both of you." They found a quiet corner away from the cameras and crowds. Chen's tone was professional, but concerned. "This is a great victory," he began. "But it's also just the beginning. Lawrence Price's organization extends beyond what we exposed tonight. We've cut off the head, but the body is still dangerous. What does that mean for us?" Marianne asked. "It means you're not safe yet. Maybe not for months." Chen handed Stephen a business card. "There's a safe house in North Carolina. Federal protection until we can be sure there are no outstanding threats." Stephen looked at the card, then at Marianne. After 9 years of separation, the idea of leaving Texas felt like another kind of exile. But this time at least they'd be together. "What about Camille?" Marianne asked. "She doesn't know any of this yet. How do I explain to an 11-year-old that her dead father is actually alive and we need to go into witness protection?" "Very carefully," Chen advised. "And soon, word is already leaking to social media, you've got maybe 12 hours before this story dominates every news cycle in the country." The drive back to Ashton Springs passed in relative silence. Stephen followed Marianne's truck in a rental car, his first time seeing the route between Houston and the farm in 9 years. So much had changed. New developments, different businesses, roads that had been widened or rerouted, but the basic landscape remained the same, rolling hills giving way to farmland, the kind of open spaces that had first drawn him to this part of Texas. It was past midnight when they reached the farm. Camille was asleep, but the porch light was on, a habit Marianne had maintained since Stephen's supposed death, a small beacon in the darkness that said someone was waiting for family to come home. "She's going to wake up when we go inside," Marianne said, standing beside her truck in the driveway. "I can't just spring this on her without warning. So, what do? We wait until morning, give her one more normal night's sleep before her world changes forever." They sat on the porch swing, the same one where Marianne had drunk coffee and planned her days for 9 years. The night was quiet, except for the sounds that belonged to rural Texas. Owls calling, the distant lowing of cattle, wind moving through the trees Stephen had helped plant when Camille was a toddler. "Do you think she'll forgive me?" Stephen asked. "For dying. That wasn't your fault. For staying dead. For letting her grow up thinking I'd abandoned her." Marianne was quiet for a long time. "She's tough," she said finally. "Tougher than either of us were at her age. But she's also been hurt. She's going to need time to process this." "And what about you?" Stephen turned to face her. "Can you forgive me?" "I'm working on it." Her answer was honest, without false comfort or easy promises. "What you did, it saved our lives. I understand that now, but understanding and forgiving aren't the same thing." "No," Stephen agreed. "They're not." Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded Stephen why he'd fallen in love with Texas sunrises. Camille's alarm would go off in an hour, followed by her usual routine of stumbling to the kitchen for orange juice and complaining about whatever homework she'd forgotten to finish. "I should wake her up," Marianne said, "before she comes downstairs and finds a stranger in her kitchen." "I'm not a stranger," Stephen protested. "To her, you are. She was 2 when you died, Stephen. Whatever memories she has of you are mostly from photos and stories. The truth of that hit like a physical blow. His daughter had grown up without him, had learned to tie her shoes and ride a bike, and deal with playground bullies without any help from her father. He'd missed her first day of school, her first lost tooth, 9 birthdays and 9 Christmases. He'd protected her life, but lost her childhood. Camille appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later, already dressed for school, but moving with the zombie-like shuffle of a teenager who hadn't had enough sleep. She stopped short when she saw Stephen sitting at the kitchen table. "Mom," her voice was uncertain. "Who's this?" Marianne moved to stand beside her daughter, one hand on Camille's shoulder. "Sweetheart, we need to talk. This is going to be difficult to understand." "But you're my dad." Camille's words cut through Marianne's careful explanation. She was staring at Stephen with the kind of intensity that made him want to look away. "You look like me, like the pictures Mom keeps on her dresser." "Yes," Stephen said simply. "I'm your father, but you're dead. You died when I was little. I had to pretend to be dead to keep you and your mother safe. Bad people were threatening our family, and it was the only way to protect you." Camille absorbed this information with the startling composure that children sometimes display in crisis situations. "So you've been alive this whole time?" "Yes." "Where have you been?" "Houston. Living under a different name. Working for the people who threatened us. Waiting for a chance to expose them and come home." "Did you think about me?" The question nearly broke him. "Every day. Every single day for 9 years." Camille nodded slowly, processing this revelation with more maturity than most adults could manage. Then she asked the question that mattered most. "Are you staying this time?" Stephen looked at Marianne, who gave him the slightest nod of encouragement. "If you'll have me," he said. "If you want me to stay." Camille studied his face for a long moment, searching for something only she could identify. Whatever she found, there must have satisfied her, because she nodded once, definitively. "Okay," she said, "but I'm going to be late for school if we keep talking." The normalcy of the statement, a 11-year-old worried about tardiness in the middle of a life-changing revelation, made both parents laugh despite everything. "Actually," Marianne said, "you're not going to school today. We need to pack." "Pack for what?" "A new adventure," Stephen said. "How do you feel about seeing the ocean?" The safe house in North Carolina turned out to be a modest 2-story cottage perched on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Federal marshals had escorted them through 3 airports and 2 rental car swaps, a journey that felt more like espionage than family relocation. But when they finally arrived at the weathered blue house with its wraparound porch and salt-stained windows, Marianne felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of peace. "It's not much," Marshal Rodriguez apologized, carrying their bags up the front steps. "But it's secure, and the neighbors think you're a family taking an extended vacation while Dad recovers from a medical procedure." Camille immediately claimed the bedroom with the ocean view, declaring it acceptable, with the kind of dramatic resignation only 11-year-olds could manage. Stephen took the smallest room, mindful that he was still earning his place in this reconstructed family. Marianne chose the master bedroom, but left the door open, a gesture of tentative trust that wasn't lost on anyone. The first week passed in a strange limbo of almost normal domesticity. They established routines. Stephen made coffee and read news reports about the ongoing investigation. Marianne worked in the small garden behind the house, and Camille attended the local middle school under her real name, but with a carefully constructed cover story about her father's recovery. But it was the conversations that mattered most. The careful rebuilding of relationships that had been frozen in time for 9 years. "Tell me about school," Stephen said one evening as they walked along the beach. Camille had been resistant to these father-daughter excursions at first, but gradually warmed to having his undivided attention. "It's school. You sit in desks, teachers talk, you pretend to pay attention." She kicked at a piece of driftwood. "Why do grown-ups always ask about school like it's the most interesting thing in the world? Maybe because we're trying to figure out who you are now. Last time I really knew you, your biggest concern was whether your juice box had the right cartoon character on it." Camille glanced at him sideways. "Mom showed me videos of when I was little. You used to read me stories about dragons. You loved those stories. Made me tell them over and over until I had them memorized. I don't remember." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Stephen heard the underlying sadness. I don't remember you at all, really. Just bits and pieces that might be memories, or might be things Mom told me." The honesty hit harder than anger would have. Stephen stopped walking and knelt in the sand so they were eye level. "That's not your fault," he said. "You were 2 years old. Nobody remembers much from that age. But you remember me. Every detail. The way you used to fall asleep with one hand tangled in your hair. How you called strawberries berries and refused to eat them any other way. The song you made up about the farm animals that didn't rhyme but went on for 20 verses. Camille studied his face with the intensity she'd inherited from both parents. "Prove it." "What?" "Sing the song if you really remember. Sing it." Stephen felt a moment of panic. It had been 9 years, and the song had been pure toddler nonsense. But as he thought about it, the melody came back, along with words that had made perfect sense to a 2-year-old's logic. "The cow says moo, the pig says oink, the chicken says hello," he began, his voice rusty but the tune unmistakable. "The horse runs fast, the sheep runs slow, the goat likes to eat everything." Camille's eyes widened. That's actually familiar. How weird is that? Memory is strange. Sometimes things hide until something else brings them back. They resumed walking, and Stephen felt something shift between them. Not complete acceptance. That would take time. But acknowledgement that maybe, possibly, they could build something new from the fragments of what had been lost. The real test came 2 weeks later, during a family meeting that none of them wanted to have. "We need to talk about what happens next," Marianne said, settling onto the living room couch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she worked up the courage to start this conversation. Stephen sat in the armchair across from her, while Camille claimed the window seat where she could watch the waves while pretending not to pay attention to serious adult discussions. "The prosecutors say we might be here for months," Marianne continued. "Lawrence Price's trial won't start until next year, and there are still people out there who might want revenge. So we just wait," Camille asked without turning from the window. "We live," Stephen said. "We figure out how to be a family again, and we wait for it to be safe to go home." "What if I don't want to go home?" The question surprised everyone, including Camille herself. "I mean, what if we like it here? What if going back to Texas just means going back to being scared all the time?" Marianne set down her coffee cup carefully. "Is that how you felt? Scared all the time?" "Not scared exactly, but careful. Like something bad was always about to happen?" Camille finally turned from the window. "Mom tried to hide it, but I could tell. The way she checked the locks twice every night, or how she got nervous when strangers came to the farm. I thought it was just how mothers were supposed to be." Stephen felt the familiar weight of guilt settle on his shoulders. His decision to fake his death had protected their lives, but it had also stolen their peace. Camille had grown up in a house shadowed by unnamed threats, and Marianne had carried that burden alone for 9 years. "I'm sorry," he said. "I never wanted that for either of you." "We know," Marianne replied. "But sorry doesn't change what happened. What matters now is what we do going forward." They spent the next hour talking through options that all felt inadequate. Return to Texas and rebuild the farm under constant security concerns. Stay in North Carolina and start over completely. Move somewhere else entirely, and hope distance would provide the safety that time hadn't yet delivered. "Can I ask you something?" Camille said as the conversation wound down. "If you had to choose between keeping us safe and being with us, what would you pick?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Stephen understood what she was really asking. If the threats came back, would he disappear again? "I would find a third option," he said finally. "I spent 9 years keeping you safe from a distance. I won't do that again. If there's danger, we face it together, or we run together, but we don't separate. Promise." "I promise." Camille nodded solemnly, then surprised them both by moving from the window seat to sit beside Stephen on the arm of his chair. "Okay," she said. "Then I guess we figure it out together." That evening, as they prepared dinner in the cottage's small kitchen, something felt different. The careful politeness that had characterized their first weeks together had given way to something more natural. Stephen and Camille debated the proper way to cook pasta, while Marianne assembled a salad from vegetables they'd bought at the local farmer's market. It wasn't the life any of them had planned, but it was theirs, and for the first time in 9 years, they were living it together. Outside, Waves crashed against the rocky shore with endless persistence, gradually wearing down even the hardest stone. Inside, a family worked on the slower, more delicate task of rebuilding trust and learning to love each other again. Spring arrived early on the North Carolina coast, bringing with it the kind of soft warmth that made everything feel possible. The cottage garden had responded enthusiastically to Marianne's attention, producing an abundance of vegetables and herbs that reminded her daily of the farm she'd left behind in Texas. But it was the sunflowers that mattered most. Seeds from her mother's collection that she'd carried across 3 states and planted with trembling hands on their first morning in the safe house. "They're getting huge," Camille observed, measuring herself against the tallest stalk. At 11, she was growing too, shooting up in height and developing the kind of confidence that came from feeling secure for the first time in her memory. "Sunflowers are survivors," Stephen said, joining them in the garden. His morning routine now included checking the plants before his first cup of coffee, a habit that reminded him of the dreams he'd once shared with Marianne about growing their own food. They turn their faces toward the light no matter what tries to knock them down. The metaphor wasn't lost on any of them. 3 months of safety had worked a kind of magic on the family. Camille had made friends at school and joined the drama club, where her natural intensity found a perfect outlet in stage performances. Marianne had started selling vegetables to local restaurants, building the kind of network that had sustained them in Texas. And Stephen had begun the slow process of rebuilding his identity, legally reclaiming his name through a maze of federal paperwork and court proceedings. But it was the small moments that told the real story of their healing. "Dad, can you help me with this stupid math homework?" Camille's casual use of the word dad still caught Stephen off guard every time. It had started hesitantly, weeks into their stay, and gradually become natural. "Let me see what we're dealing with," Stephen said, settling beside her at the kitchen table. The homework was algebra, concepts that seemed designed to torture 6th graders with their abstract complexity. "I don't understand why we need to find X," Camille complained. "Why can't X just tell us where it is?" "Because X is hiding," Stephen replied. "But if you ask the right questions and follow the clues, you can figure out where it's been all along." Camille looked at him sharply. "Are we still talking about math?" "We're always talking about math," Stephen said with a grin. "Math is life. Life is math. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Wait until you get to calculus." Their relationship had developed its own rhythm, built on shared jokes and gentle teasing rather than the profound conversation Stephen had imagined they'd need. Camille seemed to prefer discovery to explanation, learning who her father was through daily interactions rather than dramatic revelations. Marianne watched these exchanges with cautious optimism. The anger she'd carried for 9 years had gradually transformed into something more complex. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance that the past couldn't be changed and the future remained unwritten. "Any word from Marcus?" Stephen asked as she came inside from the garden, soil still clinging to her hands. "Trial date's been moved up. Lawrence Price wants to get this over with quickly." Marianne washed her hands at the kitchen sink, watching the North Carolina dirt swirl down the drain. "His lawyer thinks a fast trial will prevent the prosecution from building a stronger case. And what do we think? We think he's wrong. The evidence is overwhelming, and rushing things just makes him look desperate." Stephen nodded, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Lawrence Price's trial meant testifying, reliving the worst parts of the past 9 years, and facing the man who'd orchestrated their separation. It also meant, potentially, the end of their protective custody and a return to something resembling normal life. "Are you scared?" Marianne asked. "Terrified," Stephen admitted. "Not of testifying, but of what comes after. We've built something good here, the 3 of us. What if going back to the real world breaks it?" It was a fear they all shared but rarely voiced. The cottage had become a sanctuary where they could focus entirely on each other, without the external pressures that had defined their previous lives. Stephen didn't have to maintain a false identity. Marianne didn't have to worry about mysterious threats. And Camille could simply be a kid without carrying the weight of family secrets. The answer came sooner than any of them expected. They were having dinner on the porch, watching the sun set over the ocean, when Camille noticed the envelope first. "Someone left something by the front door," she said, pointing to a small white rectangle that definitely hadn't been there when they'd sat down to eat. Stephen was on his feet immediately, every protective instinct honed by 9 years of hypervigilance. "Stay here," he told them, moving toward the front of the house with careful steps. The envelope was expensive paper, cream-colored with Marianne's name written in elegant script. No postmark, no delivery service sticker. Hand-delivered by someone who'd gotten past federal security without being detected. Inside was a single photograph. The image showed the three of them from that very afternoon, working in the garden together. Stephen kneeling beside the sunflowers, Marianne holding a basket of tomatoes, Camille laughing at something one of them had said. It was a perfect family moment, captured by someone with a telephoto lens from considerable distance. On the back, written in the same elegant script, "Family is every hero's weakness." The scent clinging to the paper was unmistakable. Expensive cologne that Stephen recognized from countless forced dinners and political events. Senator Calloway's signature fragrance, even here, even from federal prison. "What is it?" Marianne appeared at his shoulder, having ignored his instruction to stay put. Stephen showed her the photograph and watched her face go pale. But instead of the fear he expected, he saw something else. Determination. "He's still playing games," she said quietly. "From prison, through intermediaries who got past federal protection." Stephen felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "Maybe we should consider relocating again. Changing identities completely this time." "No," Marianne's voice was firm. "I'm done running, we're done running." "Marianne, look at this picture, Stephen. Really look at it." She held the photograph up to catch the porch light. "What do you see?" Stephen studied the image again. "Our family. Exposed. Vulnerable. I see three people who aren't afraid anymore. I see a family that's been through hell and came out stronger." Marianne walked to the corner of the porch where she kept her mother's old seed box, the same one she'd carried from Texas. "Senator Calloway wants us to be afraid. Fine. Let him watch us choose not to be." She opened the box and pulled out a packet of sunflower seeds, giants that would grow 12 feet tall and produce flowers the size of dinner plates. "If they're watching us," she said, tearing open the packet, "then let them watch us bloom." Stephen understood immediately. Tomorrow they would plant more sunflowers, bigger and bolder than before. They would tend their garden in full view of anyone who cared to watch. They would live their lives openly, defiantly, and without apology. "Mom's right," Camille said, joining them with her arms full of gardening tools. "Besides, if some creepy old man wants to take pictures of us being happy, that's his problem." As they began preparing the soil for new seeds, Stephen realized that somewhere in the past 3 months, they'd stopped being victims. The threats might continue. Lawrence Price had allies, and Senator Calloway clearly still had reach. But the power dynamic had shifted. They were no longer running from their lives. They were living them, under the vast Carolina sky, with salt air carrying the promise of tomorrow's possibilities. The Whitmore family planted seeds that would grow tall enough to be seen for miles. Some flowers, they'd learned, are meant to stand out,